Thank you for having me. I'm very delighted to be here. Yeah, I've got very big soft spot for actually Brunel University since I studied there myself. I did my undergraduate in management there and then my postgraduate in HR and employment relations. So yes, I'm delighted to be here is what I'm trying to say. I thought it might be useful. I do have some slides, so I'm happy to share them. But I'm also happy for anyone to interrupt me at any point with any questions because I'd like it to be as interactive as possible. So let me try and share my screen, if I can do that. This is usual drama that I have. Share screen, here we are, people. Here, and share. Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm going to start, play from start. So I wanted to talk a little bit about today, the kind of the future of work and the power of conscious leadership. And the first thing I wanted to do is just give a bit of a background to who I am. So I guess there are three ways that I basically have shown up in the world. So I've spent a lot of my career, the majority of my career, maybe about almost 20 years in the corporate space. So I've done things like worked for companies predominantly in the technology sector. So companies like EDS, Unisys, Hewlett Packard, those types of companies, Intel. And then I moved across to work in the financial services industry. I knew nothing about the financial services industry, I have to say, coming from technology. I moved in the middle of the crash, so I don't know why I did that, but it worked out fine. But yes, in those companies, in those corporate leadership roles, I did things like anything to do with kind of change, transformation, culture, people. The last job I did was I set up Santander's Future of Work practice. So looking at culture and transformation, but actually how do we disrupt the organization from inside the business? So it was really, really interesting. So I had a corporate kind of leadership background. And then I sort of got bored and my energy got sucked out of me in the corporate world. And so I decided to then go and set up my own company. So I set up my own company to kind of do just that, still very much focus on how do we reimagine the kind of the way that we work, live and lead in today's world. How do we disrupt ourselves really mindfully to be able to sort of navigate and survive a really changing environment. So I do that now, and I also act as a board advisor to startups and scale-ups, so companies that are on a mission to kind of change the world, and whether it's a technology business or not, how do I help give them some of that experience and expertise? So that's just a little bit about me, which I wanted to share. I'm going to just talk about some of the context around how, you know, the world in which that we're operating now as organizational leaders. And I think the thing that's key is that everything is changing at breakneck speed. Everything is moving very, very quickly. And it means that it's really difficult to keep up. So I think in the past, we've had organizations, and I think back to early in my career, everything seemed to be working in a way that we've always done it like that. And actually there's best practice. You'd hear words like best practice, best in class. It kind of makes sense to look around, to see what other people are doing, to get a feel of how do you do it in the best way because somebody else is already doing it. And something that is, I think, distinctly different right now is the fact that everything's evolving so very quickly, that becomes much, much harder to do. So leading in organizations or running your own business, that becomes really tricky. So a couple of trends that I just want to share to give a bit of a backdrop. I think I've got 5 here, but the first one is all around how that digital disruption is really, really transforming everything around us. So like it's, you know, I don't have to, we can all look in the news to see the shops and the high streets, and the entire industries actually are really, really being radically transformed. We're seeing like technology emerge and create brand new industries actually. So if you think about things like, I don't know, even in healthcare, the way that doctors connect to their patients these days, when you've seen like the likes of Push Doctor and things like that, massively changing how doctors, what the role of a doctor does, the skills that they need. And the interesting thing is that there isn't an industry that is not being touched. So they're being touched in interesting ways, and I think causing havoc in some, actually. So digital disruption is real, is the first thing. The interesting thing is that, and this data is a little bit old, but I think the essence of that work, it's been updated since then. It's work done by the Global Centre of Digital Business Transformation. So a business school in Switzerland, alongside with Cisco, did some work. And their thinking is that, and their research showed us that actually disruption is a really real threat. So, you know, most leaders in their organizations see that the time to disruption is about 3 years. And when we say disruption, that means being actually displaced from where they are in their market. It's an existential threat for many people. And there are market leaders that are set to be kind of literally, you know, will be displaced completely. But the interesting thing in all of that is, at the time, only 31% of companies were feeling that they could actively respond. And that's interesting. So we know that digital threat is real, and yet you'd think the response would be much higher. And I think there's a reason for that. So on this slide, I talk a little bit about what we call Amara's law. So the trick when it comes to this, navigating this digital disruption, this world of work, is that how we respond is the most important thing. And you'll see on the right-hand side, you'll see some of these brands that are there that either no longer exist or recently gone into administration. But the interesting thing is that, you know, the Blockbuster and the Kodak story. So, you know, many of you may have heard this before, but like Kodak, for example, they no longer exist, but they were the company that had the first digital camera. They turned a blind eye and they no longer exist. Similarly with Blockbusters, they turned down Netflix, I think, for a deal, I think it was about 50 million. And now Blockbuster, you know, very different position, and Netflix is also in a very different position. So I think there is often when we look at this topic, people sort of think either it's a lot of hype, and linking to that graph, they talk about almost, they overestimate the impact of technology in the short run, but really underestimate the impact in the future. And I think one of the most important things here is, how do we look at what's going on around us, and actually how do we start to think about our response? So trend number 2 that I think is important is, when you look at all of this technology and how the world is changing, actually it's really redefining the skills that we've got in our workplace and our workforces. So in some instances, I guess technology is creating brand new roles, roles that we just didn't have before. You know, years back, I remember the time when we started hiring for data scientists, and I didn't know what that was, genuinely didn't have a clue. To be honest, I still don't think I really know what that does. But there are roles that are brand new. There are roles that are being really augmented by technology. If you think, going inside a bank today, going inside a bank feels very different to what it did 20 years ago. And equally, there are some jobs that are just not going to exist in the future. So that has turned our workplaces, you know, into something very, very different, something that's really, really evolving and very dynamic. So that's trend number 2. Trend number 3 for me is all about how actually, you know, our workforces are more complicated than what they used to be. You know, and this is a really big topic, but to try and keep it really simple, we live in a place now where we could have 5 generations inside the workplace at any one time. And on this slide, you see the interesting thing about that is that, and there's lots of different, I guess, you know, the definitions for these kind of generations, but I've used just as an anchor to give you an example. These different generations have a very different attitude to career expectations, the expectations of their workplace, aspirations, the way that they communicate, the way that they like to lead or be led or work together. It's really fascinating. So even thinking about the signature product and looking at how people are used to communicating in some, like the media that they use, that can show you that in a really small space, you've got a really varied way of varied expectations and varied aspirations. So it makes managing the workforce even more complex than what it was. And on top of that, yeah, there's lots of other things in terms of, you know, job for life. Job for life doesn't exist in the same way. You know, the people's attitudes towards careers, that's really shifting. So yeah, it makes it very tricky, I think, to start to think about when you're inside an organization, how do we coalesce teams and how do we bring them together, I feel is very different to what it has been. And I think that will continue to be increasingly more complicated. The fourth trend for me is around like the 100-year life. So one thing that we don't often talk about, and I sometimes think it gets left behind because there's such a focus on millennials and digital and everything that's new, but we actually have an aging workforce and that, or an aging population. So, you know, people are living to much longer. They are living longer than they have before. You know, living to 100 is not uncommon. And if you think 30 years back, that would be really unheard of. It would be less frequent, but actually now people are living longer, they're working longer, and that in itself is creating all kinds of challenges. So you have a workforce with a much older population. We have a workforce where actually people are no longer just looking at that 3 stages of education, employment, and retirement. It doesn't work in that way anymore. People are leaving work, taking a break, starting a new job when they might be in their 70s. That has thrown out what work life actually really looks and feels like. And then finally, technology. So like we've probably seen the last year or so that, I don't know, technology has really enabled people to work from home really very differently. And there's a term we use sometimes where people say we are now kind of, there's the homification of the office. So how do you make the office feel much more homely, but equally the officification of the home? So how do you make sure that the space that you're in at home feels right? And technology means that because we can connect from anywhere, that talent pool and the way that we can connect and collaborate with people and innovate is really broad. So that's the kind of the fifth thing. And I think the key for me around how do we survive some of this change is that we ourselves need to be more changeable. And I think that's the thing, which is a really powerful thing when I'm working with like business leaders or people inside their organizations as to how to navigate some of that complexity. We have to really start to think very mindfully and consciously about how do we do stuff in a very different way, in a way that actually is new, does feel uncertain, and actually the skills that you need to develop to be able to do that, I think can be really powerful. So conscious leadership for me is all around kind of the process by which leaders become much more, I guess, radically responsible, self-aware. They're able to be in tune, I guess, with what's happening, not just inside their organizations, but outside of their organizations and outside in that external environment, but also what's going on internally. And I mean like inside for them as they go through that change. And when a leader is able to kind of use those lenses, I think the way that they navigate the change can feel very, very different, and the outcomes can be very different. I think, you know, the idea of conscious leadership does a couple of things. It really helps to bring the concept of adaptability. And when we think about adaptability, there's benefit in it's twofold. So on one hand, there's a real organizational strength that comes from breeding adaptability inside a business and creating the right systems and structures to be able to allow that to happen. But individually also, there is something very powerful if you can do that for yourself. And I'm a big believer actually that if you can start to create the change at an individual level, you can then create the change at a team level, a cultural level, a business level, even then societal level. So I think that importance of changing oneself and being really aware, it shouldn't be underestimated. So yeah, so when it comes to organizations and people say, okay, so what does that really look like? What does this conscious leadership look like? I think to simplify it, there are there's three ways. I mean, it's a very broad topic, but three things that I think could be powerful is one, this idea of hyper awareness. So, as a business, how do you build the ways to kind of sense the changes that are happening in your internal and external environment? And how do you make sure you deeply understand how it impacts your customers, your shareholders, your people, anyone, your supply chain, even the people that your business touch? How do you start to develop that sense of awareness? And I think often in organizations, we're moving really quickly that we don't take the time to really interrogate that. The second thing that I often share with organizations is around like this idea of informed decision making. So how do we build the best structures in a company to collaborate really effectively, to leverage that collective intelligence that I think is so often untapped, by the way. I think companies have this asset of people with brilliant thoughts, ideas, and perspectives, and yet so much of that is left untapped when it comes to like solving like today's like business challenges, and making sure that also the decisions that we make are really evidence-based. So I think there is often a knee-jerk reaction into looking how else is everybody doing something, that must be the right way, and then jump into what the next shiny thing is without really exploring it. And then finally, it's this idea of fast execution. So how do we create a way to actually more rapidly test and learn what we're doing and be willing to trial and fail and move forward in a way that mitigates risk? And I think in large organizations, sometimes we can be so risk averse that actually that behavior doesn't really take hold in the big company. And I think that can be a real issue. And then at an individual level, when I think about conscious leadership and the skills that you need to navigate, I think effectively it's really simple. It's about being really mindful about the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we act as people, really. So when it comes to thinking, for me, that's all about how do you have a real presence of mind? How do you focus on what's really in front of you? How do we actively seek extra perspective? It's really easy to look at a problem from where we're standing in our shoes, but how do we consciously find the thoughts and ideas of other people to really stretch our thinking and stress test our ideas in a non-emotional way? I think feeling is actually an important part too, and often that type of language doesn't come into play in companies in the workplace today, but I think it absolutely should. And we've seen, like in the recent years, kind of an increased focus on well-being, mental health, and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's all about creating empathy and really being able to understand what's happening for people, being able to have like really meaningful conversations. And that is a skill. I think is a skill that often is an exercise when you're in an organization that's filled with power struggles, hierarchy, ego, and actually re-channeling how we have conversations can make a massive difference. And then finally, it's action, and how do we act? So how do we make sure that the action that we take, we are not attached to a desired outcome, we are willing to accept a new perspective or a new position, and almost being willing to kind of see a full bigger picture. You know, how do we think more broadly? And I think if we can look at in the systems in our organizations to build some of that infrastructure to allow that hyper awareness, that faster decision making, and equally as individuals, we look at this type of these skills and these behaviors, I think you can see a huge change in how we work. So for me, I think in a nutshell, conscious leadership is really about it's the difference between, for me, success and failure. It's the difference between growth and stagnation, and it's the difference between business and bankruptcy. And I feel like they're quite bold claims, but I think actually when it comes down to it, it's a really important, these are really important traits conscious leaders can develop and grow to like really ensure, I guess, not their own personal success or that of their teams, but also that of the businesses that they're working for and the clients that they're working with or the customers that they're serving. And, you know, in a nutshell, the way, and I know it's a very quick sort of run through, but I think we are in a period of like profound uncertainty, and that uncertainty can be really difficult for people to try and navigate, knowing what's next, knowing how to stay relevant. But I think the key is that we just need to be really open to evolve. And in order to be able to do that, I think it's really critical to be able to look both internally, externally, but also inward. So when you can combine those three, I think the results they can speak for themselves. And the Charles Darwin quote, I think, is an important one for me. I think it's all about, he says it's not about the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but it's the ones that are most responsive to change. And I think that's the key. This idea of conscious leadership, future of work, how our workplaces and our world are evolving, the key for me is around the responsiveness and how do we start to build that in our businesses, but build that for that capability or that attribute in ourselves as leaders, really. So that was my whistle-stop tour, because I know I only had 15-20 minutes and I don't even know how long it took. But just to give you a bit of a backdrop on, like what's happening, I think some of the trends, the leadership that's required that I'm seeing in some large organizations as well as startups and scale-ups. And I guess ultimately, how I try and help these companies work through that uncertainty with some of that in mind.
Thank you, Hema. This was fantastic and very insightful. Maybe we, for now, could keep the slide somewhat open, because maybe some of the students who are listening to your presentation might have a particular question regarding a specific slide. I do. Therefore, all the participants, please unmute yourself and jump right in. Let's get Hema to tell us more about these ideas, and just go right for it.
Yeah, Hema, this is Shakil here.
Hi, Shakil.
Yeah, in business world, the investors and also the executives are always time bound to deliver results like quarterly results, 6 monthly, annually, and all this plannings and all this. Everything is time bound. And particularly in the COVID time, resources are short. People are working from home. People are not all the time available for work. So if we follow the conscious leadership approach, how we can ensure as a business manager that the results are delivered timely?
Yeah, so I'll just clarify, so I'm making sure I'm understanding your question, Shakil. So you're saying we're all under pressure, resources are scarce, we are needing to deliver business results in a really quick way. And if we're going to take a conscious approach, how can we make sure that that is also not impacting adversely on the time it takes to get stuff done? Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, exactly. So I think actually the idea of being this idea of conscious leadership can really, really help with delivering effectively. And I tell you why. It's because for me, it's about actually very much focusing on the here and now. So I think a lot of the time organizations are very aware of what they need to deliver. They're thinking longer term, they think of a plan. And sometimes we go by hook or by crook trying to meet that plan as quickly as we can. And we're running a million miles an hour without necessarily stopping to think. And I think the key in this is actually by creating a little bit of space to interrogate what we're doing, how we're doing it, get that different perspective. I think there are real tangible ways that you can, it's effectively slowing down to speed up. I think I'm going to butcher this quote now, but there was a saying, if anybody has the real quote, please feel free to jump in. But I think it was by the Navy, and they said something like, I don't even know why I'm using this because I think I've now forgotten the quote, but there's something about like slow is smooth, smooth is fast, fast is deadly, something like that. But the idea is that timing of slowing down and being precise can actually create a much more effective, quicker, efficient delivery. And I think it's important. I think it's really important. And I think conscious leadership doesn't necessarily mean that you take time out consistently and not have that, focus. But it's about being really present with what's going on around you for you to be able to know how to execute efficiently. I don't know if that helps or if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. So another question is related to this, how we can improve our conscious leadership style or practice? I mean, what tools, techniques, or books, or you advise from your own experience?
Yeah, I have a whole load of books that I can share. There's what could I tell you? There's a couple of things. There's a book by Nancy Klein called Time to Think. And Time to Think is all about almost creating that space to have, well, creating the time to think effectively, creating that space inside in these conversations with people inside your organization to really effectively listen, really effectively hear. And I think that's one of the skills that's most important, because without that, the rest is almost impossible to get. It's that skill about being able to have really not just a meaningful conversation, but to be really, really inquisitive, to be really curious, to be able to listen to understand, not listen to respond. Yeah, Nancy Klein's A Time to Think is a really good book. Yeah, and there's a book called Presence as well. And there's a guy called Otto Sharma, I think, that contributed to that book. But it's all about how do you really see what's going on around you, take that time to really interrogate it and sit with it before you decide what that next step is. So there are a couple of books I'd say would be worth looking at. And it's effectively some of those skills around, building empathy, effective communication, really, really listening, being really curious. It's a mindset more than anything. I don't know if that helps.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Tim. I think there's a quote that sort of sums that up, which is, don't just do something, sit there.
Yes.
Because if you actually think and get into that mindset and consider, you reach a better decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, Tim. I 100% agree with you. I think it's part of the sort of busyness of organizations and just our worlds in general, whether you're in a company or whether you're at home yourself. I think it's really easy to be in this sort of busy mindset, and you find that we can be perpetually busy and then we somehow haven't been as productive as we could be. And it's hard to do because sometimes I think it can feel counterintuitive to kind of unplug and not do anything and actively switch your brain off. But you find that by doing that, it does create that an easier way to access, I think, insight and different perspective, which I think can then like really, really help to accelerate what you do. And I live by the thing that if I don't know what to do and I haven't got the answer, I'll basically do nothing, or I'll try my best to do nothing until I have that clarity. So that quote that you shared, I can, it definitely resonates with me.
Do we have any other questions from the viewers? If not, I'll jump in. What you were presenting made me think about an analogy from marketing. And tell me if you think I'm on track here or if I'm misinterpreting what you are saying. In marketing, we have seen, if we take a step back and we look at the macro picture over the next, say, 20 to 30 years, the power really shifted from the firm who produced the product to the consumer. Because of the trends that you outlined of digitalization, much greater visibility, technologies that allow viewers to share their reviews, their rankings. We now have a lot more power as consumers to shape the outcomes that we need as consumers for the products that we are offered, right? And even the fact that Debenhams, for example, closed after 250 years in operations, because the consumer is saying, no, this is not how we want it. And it seems to me that we possibly can say that in the world of employment and the relationship between the leadership and the employee, we also observe this shift in power. In the past, it was always with the employer. It was always with the organization. Because if you think about the assumption that you will work for this organization your entire life, that company has a lot of power over you. But now with the technology, with you being able to work from home for any company in the world, with you being able to expose dirty practices, for example, with some employers, abusive practices, lack of compassion, lack of empathy, poor working culture, you as an employee, you become a lot more powerful. And I wonder if we can almost go as far as to say these days organizations can no longer afford to ignore their employees and to ignore this need to be more conscious to the way the organization is run. What do you think? Am I on track here?
You're absolutely on track. Yeah, absolutely. I think like if you think about old school management would be very much hierarchical, would be, top down command and control. And I think there are reasons. I have a slide somewhere, but I didn't put it in here. But there are reasons why I think that has evolved. So if you think about the different industrial revolutions, every time there's been a revolution, you move from like farming to factory, you move from factory to kind of operationalizing stuff and creating structures and processes. And then you move from that to this space of digitization, and everything's much more digital. And actually, every time a shift like that happens, it changes the dynamic that of what work is there, and how people and work come together effectively. It shifts each time. And I think the difference now is that that whole digitization does really transform the relationship that people have with businesses. And that's what I find really fascinating. So you're quite right, Oksana, like if you think back, organizations, think about how they used to employ people. This is the job description. These are all the things I expect you to do for me, tick, tick, tick. And if you meet my criteria, then I might hire you. There is no two-way dialogue. There isn't like, what can you bring? There isn't this idea of like, where are your aspirations and your skills, and how can we work together to create value together? And this digitization and this world that we live in means not only does the power shift from the organization to the employee, but it does something else which I think is also interesting. It allows people to no longer rely on a big business to bring work to them. They can generate work for themselves. They can generate their own businesses. They can start something up very simply. Like how easy is it to create a shop on Etsy or wherever and like start to sell something and generate some, like it's really changed the dynamic of work. And I think that, coupled with people's expectations, in the same way that as consumers, we want choice, we want personalization, we want flexibility. We don't just want that with the way that we consume our products. Like we want that for ourselves and how we work and how we show up, I suppose. And so I absolutely agree. I think the organizations that don't start to really shift that locus of control and think differently, they'll struggle to attract the best talent. They'll struggle to keep people. And actually the idea of keeping people, once you're hired, they're there. Even that thinking's, I think, outdated.
I think it will become more and more challenging as the youngest generation starts to enter workforce, because they no longer have this expectation that they're the only in this two-way dialogue, that they're the only ones who have to provide something for the firm.
Yeah.
They enter a firm with the expectation, okay, what are you giving me in addition to my salary? And I think the retainment, not the recruitment, but the retainment of talent with Generation Z will become increasingly more challenging. Because these guys want to hop around. They will shop around for better offers, for better culture, for better work-life balance, for all these things.
Yeah. And there's so much research, isn't there, around like what motivates kind of these different generations. And I know it's a bit of a broad brush, because I'm reluctant to kind of put people in boxes, but there is more of,
I'm sure you can see it.
and so there is thinking that now people care about purpose and the mission of a company and its lens of sustainability, whereas before, those types of questions might not have been at the forefront of the conversation when you're engaging with the company. So I think it's a massive shift. And with like the ability now, I mean, we've always had tools a bit like Glassdoor, but I think now that peer-to-peer review, that people can connect so differently, information is readily available. You can't sort of hide it behind closed doors, it's very easy to find out what it's like to work somewhere else and a sense of a company. Just using
to go back to your previous slide that juxtaposed success and failure and growth versus stagnation, business versus bankruptcy. I want to play devil's advocate here a little bit, because when I teach the session on entrepreneurship, I always say that entrepreneurship, success and failure, and innovation, for example, success and failure are not the opposites. They go hand in
They
hand.
do go together.
And I wonder whether we have been for so long in this culture that either or, you're either growing or you are stagnating, you're either succeeding or you are failing.
Mhm.
And whether that has put all of us in this trap where you have to constantly fake it rather than to accept. You mentioned mental fortitude as the key skill for the future, and maybe part of it is to accept that in fact it's not always the vertical up, and it's um, cyclical and on the individual level. And some days I feel like a success, and on others I feel like an entire failure.
Yeah, yeah.
Some days I feel like I'm growing, and other days I'm stagnating and probably I don't know. So I don't know what you think about that, because
Yeah.
it seems to me that sometimes not being able to be a bit more flexible with these dichotomies puts us in a straitjacket that is very counterproductive to culture, to goals, and to just our humanity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I think the point that I think there's two things here. So I think on one hand, I work with many companies and leaders where they have a black and white perspective, so they either think this stuff is all hot air, it's not going to impact me, and I'm not going to even think about more different, I'm not going to look at outside, because what we've done for the past 30 years has made us very successful, and I'm going to bank on that for the future. So there is that lens, and it's often met with another lens that's like, we're in hot waters, and there's hot air, hot waters. I think it's almost like the other end is like everything is to the extreme, everything is disrupting. I won't have a job, robots going to take over my job. And there's this other end of that spectrum. But I do 100% agree, actually, that it is, I don't know if it's cyclical or if it's almost it's interchangeable. I think it's constantly interchangeable, but it's about, if you can hone that ability to understand your environment, what's going on outward, internally, inside for yourself, the way that you perceive success and failure is different. I'm not suggesting it's good or bad, and I appreciate how the slide comes across. I think there can be two mindsets, but similarly to you, there are days, or even in work, there's stuff that I've started, and I can give very real examples of stuff that I've started, and then they've not worked out in the way that I've had. And previously, I might have looked at that as I failed, and all of that talk that comes with not succeeding can be very apparent. But actually, now I find it more useful to ask the questions like, what have I learned? What can I take away? What would I do differently? How could I make this different? And it's that kind of mindset, I think, that much more conscious, curious, exploratory mindset that allows us to kind of weather that storm. Because I don't think anything is of black and white. In fact, I think you can do both things at the same time, interestingly, I think. So I appreciate that point. I think the either or can be dangerous, but I do think for some there is two opposing perspectives that often we can be quite closed in that.
Yeah, I think it's easy to live in this simplified dichotomous world. It's just a heuristic that you may tend to apply, but I think it's a lot more fruitful and beneficial to embrace both and to ask that question, because this would probably be my tip number one that I would take from this session. Ask yourself, what have I learned from this? And if you have learned something important, that's not a failure anymore. You have learned something.
I genuinely think every experience provides an opportunity for growth and for learning. So even in the things that feel the most difficult, I think at some point you can always step, and even if it's not apparent immediately, there's always room to look back and think, what did you learn from that? And I think once you start to do that, your perspective is very different, because you could be asking different questions. You could be sitting there question like, look at, what were all the things that I did wrong? And suddenly that anchors your perspective in a different way. So I do. I agree. I think there's an opportunity for growth in absolutely everything. I think it's just we need to ask the right questions And I also, you know, you said something interesting about that heuristic of like,
And just simplification. It's just
yeah.
a, you know, simplified way to process life and process events. But it's because it's oversimplified, it's probably not the most effective one.
And sorry, Tim again. Can I suggest instead of success versus failure, better words might be accomplishment versus, oh, I've forgotten the other word I was thinking, versus lost opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to write that down.
You know, accomplishment might not be successful, but it might be you've learned something or the business has learned something.
Yeah.
Versus not a failure, because that says all that negative things.
Yeah.
Missed opportunity might not be the right phrase. I don't know if anyone's got any other ideas, but that sort of phrasing sounds better than the black and white of success and failure.
Yeah, I'm with you on the black and white thing. I guess the thing that went through my head when you were talking, I guess both of you, I'm sort of thinking, I wonder whether it depends on, I mean, I know how it looks, but I wonder whether it's how we interpret failure as well, and what connotations we have associated with it.
Yes, you know, they say that, for example, in the Silicon Valley now, venture capitalists are more likely, a lot more likely to offer funds to startups that have experienced up to 5 failures compared to those that have experienced none.
Yeah.
That failure now is that badge of honor, while in other cultures, I know in Asia, for example, in Russia, where I'm from, failure is stigmatized, and therefore people do everything to pretend like they have not had any of those. While, for example, in the Silicon Valley, now failure is very much sought after.
Yeah.
Because people have failed, they have learned something.
Yeah, I remember I was in I was pitching for a piece of work with an energy company, and they wanted to create the proposal was all around creating a culture of innovation. So they wanted, imagine they've got the majority of their staff are sort of like average age is 50, usually, well, men, people that kind of do the kind of cables and, well, I'm not a very technical person, but the cables and the kind of all of that energy lines, cabling, electrician type stuff. And they wanted to create, they knew that smart grids were coming, and actually how do they start to innovate and start thinking differently? Like the whole industry was being impacted. And in the room, I remember asking the question, like, how do you celebrate failure? And I think I almost got laughed out of the room, because the idea that failure was okay was to them almost laughable. But anyway, by the time we'd been through the process, I did win the work, but by the time we'd been through that, I think they started to understand that the opportunity it brings for learning and improvement. But again, it's a mindset, isn't it? It's definitely a mindset.
Can I ask you to go back to the slide where you had 3 processes for leadership on the organizational level? So yeah, this one. So what would be the 3 tips for us, some actionable things that we could do if we are in a position of leadership in our organization? So what would be the 3 things that you would recommend?
Okay, so in hyper awareness, I think one thing that we could do is, I would say that one tip you could do is, how can you find, how can you seek external inspiration? So how can we make sure that we're looking not just within our company, but outside of our company? And I don't even mean in our own industry, you know, like, for example, working for a bank in the past, we might look at what other banks are doing. That's not where I suggest you look for inspiration. You look for inspiration in industries that are different from yours, because there's stuff that you can learn. So how are you incorporating, how are you, actually looking for inspiration and insight outside of your industry, looking up and out? I think that's an important thing. There was an example where I think it was the NHS, and again, I might butcher this, so if somebody knows the example better, just interrupt me, but where the NHS wanted to learn how do they get more efficient around the operating table, but obviously not compromising somebody's life. And they studied how they change wheels at Formula One, because in a really short space of time, people get together, do something with complete precision, and safety is important. and then the car moves off very quickly. So it's just an example of how do you sort of seek that learning actively. That's one thing. If I was to say informed decision making, I would be saying, how are we securing or finding as much perspective and data on it before we make a decision? So, you know, I think often leaders have the idea that they need to come up with the answers, or need to at least be seen that they've come up with the answers. And I don't think we live in a world where that is very fruitful or beneficial. So how can you create mechanisms where you're seeking the perspectives and thoughts of your team, not just your peer group, but people that work for you, and open that conversation? Because I think sometimes the best ideas come from places that you're least expecting it. So that is something I think, if you can actively do that, because it doesn't always come naturally, especially when you're in a position of leadership, that would be really helpful. And then when it comes to fast execution, I wonder how can you incorporate ways to trial something rather than just create a massive business case to incur a huge change? So I think often when we're thinking about, we want to create a change in an organization, we write a business case, we influence as many people as we can, we come up with this very long plan, we might even bring in a professional services company to help us do the change properly. And we've invested all of this time, money and effort and resource into something without even giving us the ability to test, learn, reiterate. So are there ways when it comes to a change, no matter how big or small, that you can use almost like a sprint methodology where you actually make sure the change that you're implementing is informed by a need, and then you find ways to pilot, prototype and test it in a really quick and dirty way that then therefore mitigates the risk and allows you to deliver something that actually meets the needs, the needs of whoever it's serving. Those are the three things practically that I would say that I've done inside businesses that I try to adopt in the work that I do, and I think have been probably most useful.
And on the individual level, going to your next slide, the three things. The first one, we already, at least to me, the takeaway is ask the question, what have you learned?
Yeah, you can ask the question.
That creates that space where growth is possible and where consciousness can flourish, really. So what are the three tips for us as individuals?
3 tips for individuals. So I think under the first one, I think it's about creating the space with everything that you're doing, just creating that space to almost not do, but just be. So almost like, can you create the room to not think about what the next task is and how do we need to get it done, but actually unplug and allow yourself that, create more room and more headspace. I think that can be a really powerful thing to do. You'll find that, and I certainly have done this, there are things that I could have been looking at for 3 weeks to try and put together, and somehow in 10 minutes I've solved the problem, but I've given myself that room. So I think it's something that is a powerful thing. Under the feeling thing, I wonder if, as an experiment, how could you have a conversation with somebody and ask them questions that you don't normally ask, or genuinely be curious about, really listen about what they're sharing with you and build on what's coming back. Because I think often we go into conversations all the time with a predefined response or an idea of what we're trying to come out of that conversation. And actually, if you were to let go of all of your expectations and just listen, see if that changes the dynamic of the interaction that you have. Because I think it suddenly can create a sense of feeling acknowledged, seen and heard for the other person. But the insight that you get from there can be way more powerful than than going in that with a preconceived idea. So trying to have a conversation very differently, where you're genuine from a explorer mindset, I think would be an interesting experiment. And then finally, this is about kind of like being willing to kind of accept a different perspective. you know, maybe one thing that's useful here is if you've got an idea or thought or an idea of how you're going to do something, how do you actively go and seek the perspective of somebody that has a completely opposing idea and see what happens when you just have that conversation? Because then you suddenly, you know, if you go into that conversation where you've got two opposing thoughts and ideas or perspectives, you'll end up getting extra perspective, and you might create new ideas and operate from a new place. But you can only do that if you, I think, you actively seek it. Those are the three things that I would say could be useful at a very personal level. And certainly I think lend themselves to whether you're at home or whether you're at work, whether you're with, individual, whether you're with your team.
Well, I will speak for myself. I certainly can use more consciousness in all areas of my life. I think all of them will benefit from these tips. I will ask my last question. What is your connection to Brunel?
Oh, so I went to Brunel many years ago. So I did my undergraduate at Brunel University. I did my undergraduate in management, and I did an internship. So year 3, I went out and did a placement. And then I wasn't ready to go to work. So I then did my master's at Brunel as well. So I did a MSc in HR and employment relations. So yeah, my fascination of people and business, how they come together and how do they create value, I think was born at Brunel, and it's been there ever since. So yes, yeah, soft spot for me.
Well, we're really pleased to have graduates who have achieved that much. That's great. Any other questions? I think maybe we can stop sharing the presentation now, unless students have some specific questions regarding some slides. I think this has been a great conversation, and the challenge to all of us is to think what it is that we can implement today in whatever area of activity that we are confronting, to have greater consciousness. I think it's an important thing to consider.
Brilliant. It was a pleasure to be here, actually. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed
Paul
it.
is saying that he has no questions, but the talk was thought-provoking for him. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for turning up, for showing up. I know all of you are very stressed. Try to create a little bit more room as you're preparing for your finance exam, to embrace the challenge and to be more conscious about what you're learning, what you're struggling with, and how it's making you stronger, how it's building up your fortitude, mental fortitude, emotional fortitude. Thank you so much, Hema.
You're welcome. I wish everybody the best of luck with their exams.
Thank you.